Chapter 3. Pluralistic Materialism, the System of Hobbes. 1. The Materialistic Doctrine of Hobbes. Modern philosophy, as has appeared, starts from the qualitatively dualistic standpoint natural to the stage of life at which reflection begins, but it is almost inevitably led to the correction of this dualism. The difficulty inherent in qualitatively dualistic systems such as those of Descartes and of Locke is clearly the following. Granted that reality is of two fundamentally unrelated kinds, spiritual and material, how does it happen that an individual of the one sort has an influence on an individual of the other? Why do material things affect a mind so as to produce sensations, and why does a mind induce voluntary movements in a body, if, as Descartes teaches, material substance is independent of any spiritual substance, save only God? Must not we even ask how God, a spiritual substance, can create or influence material things, if spirits and material realities are totally unrelated? The difficulty thus involved in asserting on the one hand the unrelatedness, on the other the necessary relation, of minds and bodies, is the problem met by the systems of qualitative monism. These systems remove the source of the difficulty by denying the twofold nature of reality. Bodies and minds, they declare, affect each other simply because they are inherently one in nature. The apparent unlikeness is subordinate to a real unity. Two main forms of monism are logically possible. The monist may teach that all realities are ultimately ideal, that is, of the nature of consciousness, or he may teach that all realities are fundamentally non-ideal, not of the nature of consciousness, and existing independently of any selves or any ideas. Of non-idealism also there are two forms. Ultimate and non-ideal reality may be conceived as material, that is, as partaking of a character, or of several characters, of the physical universe. It may be conceived, for example, as motion or as energy, or ultimate reality may be conceived as an unknown reality, neither ideal nor material, but manifested both in minds and in bodies. The earliest of English philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, better known for his philosophy of government than for his metaphysics, developed a striking system of materialism. In truth, his inimitably vigorous treatises, both philosophical and political, breathed a defiance of traditional beliefs in curious contrast to his personal timidity. The works of Hobbes were later published than those of Descartes, though he was by 8 years the older. He conceives of all reality, bodies and so-called spirits, physical processes and ideas, as ultimately corporeal in their nature. A preliminary sketch of the doctrine. The universe being the aggregate, Hobbes says, of all bodies, there is no real part thereof that is not also body. Bodies, he teaches, are of two sorts, less and more subtle. The less subtle, in other words, the visible and palpable, bodies are commonly known as bodies, or external things. The more subtle bodies, on the other hand, are called spirits, and are further distinguished from bodies of the more palpable sort, in that they contain within themselves the representations of other things. In the words of Hobbes, some natural bodies have in themselves the patterns almost of all things, and others of none at all. Descartes had taught that the universe is made up of God, finite spirits, and bodies. Hobbes accepts the words of this teaching, but insists that finite spirits and infinite spirit are alike corporeal in nature. The existence of finite spirits he acknowledges without argument. For the existence of a supreme being, God, he argues much as Descartes had done. He that from any effect he seeth come to pass, should reason to the next and immediate cause thereof, and from thence to the cause of that cause, and plunge himself profoundly in the pursuit of causes, shall at last come to this, that there must be, as even the heathen philosophers confessed, one first mover, that is, a first and an eternal cause of all things, which is that which men mean by the name of God. But beyond the certainty that God is really somewhat, since body is doubtlessly a real substance, and the reasoned conviction that he is first cause of all causes we have, Hobbes teaches, no knowledge of his nature. We may not attribute to him figure or place, nor ascribe to him sight, or knowledge, or understanding, or passions, for that were, Hobbes declares, to circumscribe him within the limits of our fancy. Thus, he says, all that will consider may know that God is, though not what he is. Along with natural bodies, thus enumerated, Hobbes also recognizes what he calls the commonwealth. Two chief kinds of bodies offer themselves, he says, to such as search after their generation and properties, one whereof being the work of nature, is called a natural body, the other is called a commonwealth, and is made by the wills and agreement of men. And from these spring the two parts of philosophy, called natural and civil. This is not the place in which to discuss the civil philosophy of Hobbes, though he is best known by his brilliant and paradoxical political theory. As is evident from the preceding summary, his natural philosophy or metaphysics is really a system of physics, a doctrine of body. Accordingly, he names his chief metaphysical work De Corpora, concerning body, and divides it into 3 parts. 1. The first grounds of philosophy. 2. The properties of motions and magnitudes. 3. Physics or the phenomena of nature. Under this last head, Hobbes describes both the world of external nature, of light, heat and colors, cold, wind, ice, lightning and thunder, to quote from his chapter headings, and also the inner world of consciousness, of sight, sound, odor, savor, and touch. His whole philosophy is simply a development of the teaching which he summarizes in these words: the world, I mean the whole mass of all things that are, is corporeal, that is to say, body, and that which is not body is no part of the universe. b. The doctrine of Hobbes concerning the nature of bodies. This preliminary sketch of the doctrine of Hobbes must be supplemented by a closer study of his conception of body. He defines body as that which, having no dependence upon our thought, is coincident or coextended with some part of space. This definition assigns to body two characteristics: 1. Independence of thought, and 2. Spatialness or extension. A consideration of the first of these characters reveals a certain ambiguity in Hobbes' expression. As it stands, the statement that body is independent of thought implies the dualistic doctrine that thought as well as body has reality. But the reiterated statements of Hobbes, that spirit is a form of body, forbid this view and justify us in the conclusion that Hobbes means by body that which is ultimately non-consciousness, not ideal. The second and more positive character of body is its coincidence with some part of space. Space, which is the same thing Hobbes says, with extension or magnitude, is here to be understood as real space. It does not depend upon our cogitation. It is a property or accident or faculty of body. Here again, Hobbes' doctrine of body is in harmony with that of Descartes. A third and once more positive character of body is often recognized by Hobbes, though not included in the definition just quoted. This is motion, which he defines as a continual relinquishing of one place and acquiring of another. Thus conceived, motion seems to be a complex attribute of body, consisting of spatial position and temporal succession. Hobbes, however, though he often implies that motion is subordinate to extension, more often regards it as an attribute of body coordinate with spatialness. Motion and magnitude, he says, are the most common accidents of bodies. He is at pains to emphasize also two subsidiary theories concerning motion, both following from the doctrine that reality is corporeal. The first is the teaching that all forms of change are motion. Mutation, he says, can be nothing else but motion of the parts of that body which is changed. This is obviously true on Hobbes' principles. For if all reality is body, and if body is spatial, then the only change possible certainly is change of place, that is, motion. The second of the corollaries of his materialistic doctrine concerns the cause of motion. Hobbes teaches that there can be no cause of motion, except in a body contiguous and moved. The proof which he offers for this teaching that motion must be caused by the impact of a moving body is, in his own words, the following. A cause is such that being supposed to be present it cannot be conceived, but that the effect will follow. But if a body be untouched by any other, and if it be supposed to be now at rest, we may conceive it will continue so till it be touched by some other body, and in like manner seeing we may conceive that whatsoever is at rest will still be at rest, though it be touched by some other body, except that other body be moved. Therefore in a contiguous body which is at rest, there can be no cause of motion. It is needless to discuss in further detail Hobbes' doctrine of the nature of reality. His philosophy becomes, indeed, a mixture of geometry and mechanics. He discusses motion accelerated and uniform, the figures deficient the equation of straight lines, with the crooked lines of parabolas angles of incidence and reflection, the dimension of a circle circular motion, the center of equiponderation refraction and reflection. On most of these subjects his views are, to say the least, now antiquated, and he was never other than an amateur in mathematics, but his introduction of these topics is entirely consistent. For if every part of the universe is body, the mathematical laws of the physical world are indeed the principles of all reality. C. The argument of Hobbes. From this outline of the system of Hobbes, it is necessary now to come to a consideration of the arguments by which he reaches his conclusions. It is fair to say that he himself lays little stress on these arguments, and that for the most part he asserts and makes plausible, instead of arguing, his materialistic teaching. In the first place, Hobbes reduces all qualities of the external world to extension and motion. This he achieves by arguing for the fantastical character of the remaining qualities. 1. It is universally agreed, Hobbes first points out, that certain images, by which he means sense ideas, for example, the percept of an oar's bent in a stream, and the hearing of an echo, are merely fantastical, that is, that no real objects correspond to these images. But this admission throws doubt on the existence of any real shape, or color, or sound corresponding to the consciousness of these qualities. Why should there be a real oar corresponding to one's percept of a straight oar, if there is no real oar corresponding to one's percept of the oar is bent? Or why should there be a real sound which tallies with the hearing of a shout, and no real sound parallel with the equally clear hearing of the echo? 2. It is certain, Hobbes also argues, that the same object produces different ideas in different people. For instance, it is apparent enough, he says, that the smell and taste of the same thing are not the same to every man. But the smell and taste which vary with every observer are not, Hobbes says, in the things smelt and tasted, but in the men. 3. A consciousness of light, Hobbes proceeds, may be produced not by any external object, but by direct stimulation of the end organ. In this case, it is clearly wrong to infer from the apparition of light the existence of any external light. All that can rightly be inferred is the occurrence of motion in the organ. For Hobbes, as for Descartes, the implication of all these facts is that the things that really are in the world without us are motions. But Hobbes goes further than Descartes and argues that consciousness, because caused by motion, is itself a form of motion. Consciousness, Hobbes points out, is the inevitable consequent of brain and nerve excitations, and these in turn follow upon motions in the external object. For example, it is evident, he says, that fire worketh by motion, and further, that motion whereof the fire worketh is dilation and contraction of itself alternately. From such motion in the fire must needs arise a rejection or casting from itself of that part of the medium which is contiguous to it, whereby that part also rejecteth the next, and so successively one part beateth back another to the very eye, and in the same manner the exterior part of the eye presseth the interior, and therefore the motion is still continued thereby into the brain, and thus all vision hath its original from such motion as is here described. It follows, Hobbes believes, that operations of the mind, or as he calls them, conceptions and apparitions, are nothing really, but motion in some internal substance of the head, which motion not stopping there but proceeding to the heart, must there either help or hinder the motion which is called vital. When it helpeth it is called delight, which is nothing really, but motion about the heart, as conception is nothing but motion in the head, but when such motion hindereth the vital motion, then it is called pain. This is the familiar argument which has given all materialistic theories their force. Consciousness is observed to follow, and, in some sense of the word, to depend, on physical processes, notably those of the brain, and is, therefore, easily conceived as itself a form of physical process, a function of the brain. 2. Critical estimate of the doctrine of Hobbes. The attempt to estimate the system and the arguments of Hobbes, thus outlined, must follow on this exposition. To students of the history of philosophy, it is evident that Hobbes reduces consciousness to motion in essentially the fashion in which, in succeeding centuries, Holbach and Watt and Haeckel have argued that mind is a function of matter. In every form of his argument, Hobbes assumes the ultimately material nature of that motion in the external object which, when continued into the brain and to the heart, becomes the antecedent condition of consciousness, and he assumes also the inevitable likeness of effect to cause. He argues, in other words, that because motion causes consciousness, therefore consciousness is motion. To this conclusion several objections may be raised. In the first place, Hobbes does not prove, any more than Descartes had proved, that effect and cause must resemble each other. Everyday observation shows us many exceptions to the rule. Even therefore, if one grant that consciousness is caused by motion, it does not follow that Hobbes is right in his constant assertions that consciousness is a form of motion. From this indication that Hobbes does not prove his point, we may go a step farther. When he says that a given consciousness, conception, or pleasure, or pain, is nothing really, but motion, he must mean that this consciousness is a kind of motion. Now the final authority on the nature of consciousness is consciousness itself. In other words, by introspection only may one know what consciousness is. But introspection of any given consciousness will assure anyone that it is not identical with the brain excitation which is its physical correlate. The sensation of red may be caused or accompanied by motion and agitation of the brain, but the sensation of red, as directly known by us, is not identical with the brain excitation which occasions it. One could not, for instance, replace the term color sensation by the term occipital lobe excitation, as would be possible if the two terms stood for an identical reality. A final objection of an utterly different sort may now be urged against the materialism of Hobbes. Even if one granted the validity of his arguments, his doctrine would refute itself, for body, conceived as he conceives it, as the space filling or moving, turns out to be a mere nothing, or else itself a form of consciousness. This objection must be made good by a careful re-examination of his teaching about body, or matter. Body, it will be recalled, is conceived by Hobbes as 1. Independent, as 2. Spatial, and as 3. Possessed of motion. The first of these is obviously a negative character. Spatialness, on the other hand, has the appearance of a positive attribute of body. But space, magnitude, is defined by Hobbes as the peculiar accident of everybody, and accident is defined as that faculty of anybody, by which it works in us a conception of itself, so that real space, according to Hobbes, is no more than this cause of the conception of space. In other words, space is defined in terms of consciousness. Our only clue to the nature of real space is then our acquaintance with the idea of space. But such a view endows consciousness with a more certain and primary reality than that of body, and this conception, though plainly implied by the definitions just quoted, is of course at utter variance with the materialistic doctrine of Hobbes. The consciousness or idea of anything is indeed, on his view of it, the mere phantasm or appearance of body, less real, not more real, than body. Combining the conclusions of Hobbes himself, we have then the following curious result. The peculiar attribute of body is space. Space can be defined only as cause of the consciousness of space. The consciousness of space is the effect of space, it has only superficial reality of its own. In other words, X is the cause of Y, and Y is the effect of X, and this is all that is true of either of them. The statement that Hobbes has no positive conception of body is justified, therefore, so far as the independence and the spatialness of body are concerned. How, then, does it fare with the third attribute, motion? Hobbes' definition of motion has been quoted, the continual relinquishing of one place and acquiring of another. He conceives motion, in other words, as succession of places, that is of spatial modifications. This space factor of the conception need not be further considered, for it has just been shown that, on the principles of Hobbes himself, space is either mere consciousness, a conclusion which Hobbes denies, or that it is the unknown cause of consciousness. The character which, added to spatial position, gives motion is succession. How then does Hobbes define succession? Has it that positive character which we are seeking, in order to give positive meaning to body? The words of Hobbes are these. As a body leaves a phantasm of its magnitude in the mind, so also a moved body leaves a phantasm of its motion, namely an idea of that body passing out of one space into another by continual succession. And this idea, or phantasm, is that which I call time. Succession is thus defined by Hobbes as the reality which corresponds to the idea, time. As space was found to be the cause of the idea of space, so succession becomes that whose idea is time. And in the case of succession, as in that of space, the idea seems to be more important than the real succession, seeing that this latter virtually is defined in terms of the idea. Such a conclusion again runs counter to Hobbes' formal doctrine, and we are forced to decide that his conception of succession, that character which, added to spatialness, place, gives motion, is entirely vague. The results of the teaching of Hobbes about motion may then be stated somewhat as follows. An essential attribute of body is motion. Motion is a complex of spatial positions in a succession. Succession can be defined only as cause of the idea of succession, time, and space only as cause of the idea of space. Yet ideas of spatial position and of succession have no character except that of being effects of space and of succession. There is no escape for Hobbes from the inconsistency of insisting that bodies only, and not ideas, have reality, and at the same time of conceiving body only as it is related to ideas. The difficulty could, to be sure, be avoided by admitting that ideas are realities and not mere appearances of something else. Often, indeed, Hobbes seems almost to embrace this view. He defines time, a most obstinate reality, it would seem, as an idea. He makes the impossibility of conceiving the opposite a test of causality, thus setting up consciousness, the so-called phantasm, as test of physical causality. He calls place a phantasm which is nothing out of the mind, and he defines not only space, succession, and motion, but infinity, line, surface, and the like, in terms which presuppose the existence of consciousness. Everything, he says, is finite or infinite according as we imagine or do not imagine it, limited or terminated every way. If a body which is moved be considered as long, and be supposed to be so moved, as that all the several parts of it be understood to make several lines, then the way of every part of that body is called breadth. From these definitions, it would appear that our imagining and considering and understanding are essential features of reality, not mere unreal appearances. Hobbes never realizes the significance of these idealistic implications of his teaching. He never yields the view that spirit is a subtle and invisible body, and that consciousness is a bodily excitation. He never fails to conceive the universe as a totality of material things. And in spite of the objections to his system, he has certainly achieved two results. He has formulated, in the first place, a materialism more complete than any since the days of Democritus, a materialism which embraces man, society, and God. He has suggested, in the second place, the argument which must be squarely met by all opponents of materialistic systems. The argument, still urged by materialists of our own day, that consciousness, because continuous with the unbroken succession of so-called physical and physiological phenomena, is itself a function of the body. The main influence which Hobbes exerted was not, it must be confessed, upon strictly metaphysical thought. He is best known by the teaching of his ethics and his politics. The doctrine that all men are essentially selfish and that morality and government alike arise only after experience has shown that each man for himself runs greater risks and gains less satisfaction than through cooperation. The ethical systems of Cudworth, Cumberland, and Shaftesbury, to name no others, are reactions against this teaching, and that of Manville was a variation upon it. Yet in spite of the predominance of practical philosophy among British thinkers, and in spite of the uncritical condemnation of Hobbes' metaphysics, along with his loudly decried ethics and politics, his materialistic teaching nonetheless reappears. John Toland, best known for his deistical writings, in other words for his defense of reason as contrasted with revealed religion, teaches, as Hobbes had taught, that all reality is corporeal, that thought is the function of the brain as taste of the tongue. And like Hobbes, he lays stress on the essential activity of matter. To such a materialistic conclusion Hartley tends in his observations on man, arguing that soul no less than light may be material, and that the traces or vibrations in the brain are our ideas. And later still Joseph Priestley asserts unequivocally the materiality of the soul and of God, using the arguments already outlined, and insisting also on the difficulties of Cartesian dualism. All these British materialists, including Hobbes himself, are convinced of the existence of God, and are hereby sharply contrasted with the French materialists of the 18th century, for these believe that God is logically de trop in a world which is purely material. Lemaitre, rejecting all the spiritualistic side of Descartes' doctrine, reasons from the analogy of Descartes' automaton animal body to the conclusion that man also is a mechanism, a home machine, as he expresses it in the title of his most important book. And Holbach and Cabanis with equal vigor insist that thought is a function of the brain, and that God is superfluous in a world ruled by mechanical law. But even more important than the reassertion of materialism is the reaction upon it. To the consideration of this we must now turn.